All right, everybody. We are winding down to the last two chapters of the semester, and they both deal with some sort of conflict or deception, really the dark side of communication. So, first, we'll start with interpersonal conflict. And so, in this chapter, we're going to go over the nature of interpersonal conflict, talk about it in personal relationships, how power influences conflict, and how to manage it. So first of all, we need to define it, right? What is interpersonal conflict? An interpersonal conflict is an expressed struggle between at least two interdependent parties. We'll talk about that in a second, who perceive incompatible goals, scarce resources, and interference from the other party in achieving their goals. Woof! What a definition. That is so thick. Let's break it down. Okay, so I go back to the interdependent part. If you remember, interdependent means you can still be your own people, but you rely on each other. So it's a more personal relationship. And when we talk about incompatible goals, it just means I want this, you want this, and they can't. One of them has to be the superior goal, or one of them has, in order for one goal to be met, the other one has to fail. Scarce resources. If you've ever played Catan, you know, there's only so many sheep and woods. If you've never played Catan, that reference means nothing to you. But scarce resources just means there's a finite amount of, I mean, when we talk about resources, time, money, space, things like that. And so the conflict is the fact that we only have so much of it. We need to make sure it goes to the right thing. And that goes back to incompatible goals. And then finally, the end of this is the interference from the other party in achieving their goals. So if your goal doesn't match theirs and it's incompatible and there's not enough resources for both goals, that means you're interfering with the other person's opportunities to achieve that goal. So let's go back to the full definition. Interpersonal conflict is spoken, we say expressed, spoken struggles between two interdependent or personally known people who see each other's goals as incompatible with each other, and with scarce resources like time, money, or space, that it interferes with them getting their own goals done. And again, these conflicts are often expressed verbally, but they can be shown non-verbally. So let's get into it. I hope that helped break down the definition because it was a mouthful. Okay, so points to remember from that definition. And again, we're going through this definition because it's really important that we know what it is. So as we go through the rest of the chapter, we know what to look for. So conflict is an expressed struggle. So it's more than just disagreeing. The other party has to know that you don't agree. So it's a behavior you're showing. And again, it can be verbal or nonverbal. And it occurs between two or more parties. And all conflict involves a disagreement. However, not all disagreements become conflicts. So let's talk about that. Disagreements become conflict when there is interdependence. So you cannot have conflict with someone who you don't have an interpersonal relationship with. So not being super political here, but you can disagree with a celebrity or a president, with their policies or the way they look at things or do things. You can disagree with that, absolutely. But it is not conflict because you do not have an interpersonal relationship with that person. You can also have internal conflict. And I'm sure enough that we've all had internal conflict, and that's conflict with yourself. You want to do something, but you know it's not the right thing, or you should do the right thing, but you know it's going to be hard or it's going to impact the way that your goals are set, right? We have internal conflicts about a lot of things. Okay. And so with conflict, it's about the goals that the parties are perceived to be incompatible. Again, we talked about that. You want to try, so an example of this in an interpersonal relationship, say you want to buy a TV, but your spouse wants to save for vacation. So we talk about the scarce resource being the money, and the goals being you wanting a TV and your spouse wanting to save for a vacation. Both of those cannot happen because of the scarce resource. So you have to juggle which one to do. And it includes, this conflict includes interference. So your conflict has to interfere with the goals of your partners or your interpersonal relationship with whoever you're with. And so part of it could also be, say your roommate likes to smoke, but you don't want her to smoke. So you guilt her or you hide her smokes. This is interference because A, if you guilt her, she probably feels worse when she smokes, so she can't enjoy it. That's interference. The physical interference is you hide her smokes. So she quite literally cannot smoke because she doesn't have anything to smoke. That was a lot. I feel like I just zipped through all this. So breaking it down, conflict is expressed struggle. Both parties have to know that is conflict. It has to be two or more people that are interdependent. So you have to have an interpersonal relationship with them. It can't be a disagreement where it's like a celebrity or a president or someone that doesn't know. The goals of both parties have to be impacted, and they have to be seen as incompatible. So you want a TV, your spouse wants a vacation, and it has to come up because of scarce resource. So you're fighting over the money, which is a scarce resource in that example. And then, of course, it has to include some sort of interference. So in this example of smoking, you guilt your roommate or you hide her smokes. That is interference, whether that be psychological or physical interference. So these are important parts of the definition of conflict. So now, when you think about your own experiences with interpersonal conflict, sometimes we give them our own figurative or like metaphorical language. And some most often used, I've taken some from the textbook because some of them I don't agree with, but sometimes we reflect on how well each of us follow these metaphors and how we view our own sorts of conflict. So some of my most known ones, I would say, is conflict is a war. So conflict is a series of battles with winners and losers. And think about that conflict with your spouse between the TV and the vacation. Someone has to win and someone has to lose because there's just not enough money to do both. Conflict is a struggle. So conflict is a difficult and ongoing part of life. It's never something that's going to end. It's an ongoing thing, whether it be the same conflict or different conflicts. It's an inherent part of your life. Conflict is a mess, meaning that conflict is messy, and because of that, it contaminates other aspects of our lives. So if you continuously have conflict with the same people, it can sour, if it's not dealt with properly, it can sour that relationship. What else? Conflict's a tide. I do like this one as well. Conflict ebbs and flows. And sometimes we can predict when it's going to happen based on experience with the person you're having the conflict with. And then finally, one of the other examples I'm going to use is conflict is a dance. Partners learn how to move with each other through the conflict episodes. So again, you know that you consistently have these discussions with your partner, so it may differ from time to time how you handle that conflict. Okay, so now that we've defined conflict and we thought about what it is, let's adapt it to personal relationships. So conflict in personal relationships is natural. It's not inherently negative. It's a natural and normal to have conflict from time to time. Think about if you didn't have conflict. That means you and your partner or you and somebody who you're close with are consistently on the same page. And we're humans, like we all have different opinions about everything. And it's very unlikely that you meet somebody who will always agree with everything you have to say. So even though we think conflict and we think negative, that's not necessarily true. Conflict has content, relational, and procedural dimensions. So when we think of conflict from a content dimension, you're focusing on a particular issue to disagree on that leads to a conflict with your partner. So the specific issue that you're looking at, maybe their smoking habits, maybe they do something that you believe is inherently wrong, like steal, or they gamble away your life savings. That's actually a pretty big conflict. And then you have relational conflict. And so while content is focusing on a particular issue that you disagree on, relational conflict is how that conflict can affect your relationship. So if you use a stealing example, if someone stole from you, but they apologized, um, but going forward, you only focus on how to trust them in the future. So you may forgive them in that moment, but it's always going to impact your relationship going forward. So relational conflict is what that conflict does to your relationship. And then, of course, you have procedural. And procedural is the rules and expectations when an argument happens. So one person may want to have a conversation and hash it out, but the other person may want to avoid conflict and let it blow over. So this is the procedural dimension because, again, and we talked about this earlier on in last chapter, is sometimes the expectation in how we handle conflict differs. Some people are more private, and some people really need to have that conversation. And so those are the three types of dimensions. You got content, relational, and procedural. And again, these can all happen to everybody in one specific conflict. But it can also it might just you might only have a conflict about where you focus on the issue, and that doesn't bring into your relationship or the dimensions of your relationship. And then, of course, we also want to talk about conflict or meta conflict. So when you think of meta conflict, you might think of some phrases like, you always want to fight, or you never want to talk about our disagreements. And those are meta conflicts because it's a conflict about how you guys fight or about how you conflict with one another. This can be direct, and with conflict. It can be direct or indirect in relationships. So direct would be dealing with conflicts, opening discussions, and discussing the conflict or discussing the disagreements. So direct, how to spend money with your spouse. You have that discussion. It's not something that you're beating around the bush. You know that the disagreement's there. You have a conversation with your spouse or your partner, and that is a direct conflict. Indirect conflicts are a little more toxic. This is behaving in ways that are vengeful or hurtful to the other person. And then this prevents the conflict from being resolved and can actually worsen your relationship. So ignoring your partner, say you got into a fight with your partner, okay? And now your partner and you are out and about, and you decide you want to flirt with somebody else to upset them. That's indirect conflict behavior. And that again, like just thinking about that could only worsen a relationship. It's definitely not going to make it better, because you're avoiding the initial conflict, and now you're potentially creating a new one. And then conflict can be harmful in many ways, and we'll talk about it in a couple. So it'd be harmful in the sense that conflict alleviates or elevates stress, rather, and it can cause health issues. It can also lead to aggressive behaviors. One study showed that when otherwise healthy couples fought, and when the husbands were overly controlling or the wives were overly hostile, they did CT scans and found that they had, like, I think it was like a couple weeks later. And because, sorry, I'm recording from home today and my cat just jumped on my lap. So what I was saying was they did the CT scan, I think a week or a couple days later, and they actually found that their arteries in their heart had hardened versus the couples who weren't asked to act that way or to discuss a pretty heated debate. So it can really conflict can kill you. But it can also, I mean, when we talk about elevating stress, we've talked about many chapters about how stress can cause heart disease, and the health issues that we just looked into the study. But it also can lead to aggressive behaviors, which can be harmful in themselves. So aggressive behaviors could include verbal, physical, or sexual. And while women are mostly victimized this way, it is not just exclusive to women, it can be men as well. And oftentimes, these aggressive behaviors can come out when alcohol is a factor. Alcohol often plays a key role in aggressive behaviors in relational conflicts. Now, yes, it can be harmful. It can also be beneficial. Working through conflict in a healthy way can actually help us. Um, if you have something that's bothering you and you talk to your partner right away about it, you take that small issue and you snuff it out. And then now you've also learned how to snuff it out or how to prevent it from happening in the future because you've had an open dialogue with your partner. So it helps prevent those small problems from all puzzle piecing together and creating a big problem. Prevents explosive arguments. And it also helps develop confidence in your relationship when you know that you can speak to your partner openly and without criticism or with constructive criticism, and how you can continuously improve that relationship. So it can be beneficial as well. We just got to do it right. In your textbook, there is a dark side box, and we look at the light side and the dark side of most of the things we talk about. But this one focuses, I want to go back to it. This one focuses on alcohol and conflict. So I want you to sit with this for a minute and think, why do you think alcohol affects people's experiences with conflict? In the example that we use in the textbook, it's the Real Housewives of Beverly Hills. And if you've ever watched a Real Housewives episode and you see conflict, you realize that oftentimes alcohol is involved right before a big blow up on the show. So why do you think that is? From my personal opinion, oftentimes if we think about it, when we drink, what happens? We lower our inhibitions, we become more confident, we maybe say things that are on our minds that we wouldn't say sober because we have more filters when we're sober. We always think of drunken words or sober thoughts. Now that may not always be true, but it can definitely influence. And that's how I think. So let me know if you maybe had the same thought that I did. Okay. So now we're going to talk about common topics in conflict, specifically in marriage. So these are some of these are 8, but obviously it's not exhaustive. It's not an exhaustive list. And so some of those include like personal criticism, finances, chores, children, employment, in-laws, sex, and use of time. And so these conflict triggers are issues that lead to conflict. And so personal criticisms, always being told, or also let's make that an easier term, nagging, always picking at things about your partner, or so your partner picks things about you that they don't like, and then consistently criticizing you as a person. Finances is one of the leading reasons for divorce. And that is because finances, we've always been told, are taboo to talk about, but often when you're in that trouble, it becomes like a gag, and you just like you can't get the words out. They're always stuck in your throat because it's such an overwhelming mountain to come over to get over. And so oftentimes partners won't talk about them because of how hard it is to get over that. And then when they're finally in that spot where they're just in financial distress, the fights happen, and sometimes it leads to blame, and yeah, it can be chaotic. And I'm tying that also in with employment, because sometimes employment, I mean, or lack thereof, can cause the financial issues. And all of these can be really intertwined, or when a conflict arises, it may start with one but lead to another. Maybe employment takes you away from the home for too long, and it causes causes a rift between you and your partner, which leads to less time for them to talk about, or less time with the children and chores or sex, things like that. So these all seem pretty straightforward. I'm not going to go into definitions of each of them. But I wanted to this is where I'm going to put one of the few examples that I have this week. And it's from the movie The Breakup, starring Vince Vaughn and Jennifer Aniston. And now, while, I mean, it's in the title, they break up. You do see this movie. I mean, if you've ever watched it or you want to watch it, you do see really how a relationship that is not fed with open communication lines of communication, and is rather fed with indirect conflict behaviors, can get toxic very quickly. So it started with chores and personal criticism, but realistically, through this entire fight, you can see personal criticism, chores, use of time, finances, sex gets brought up just briefly. So take a look at this video, and I will see you on the other side of that video. And as always, I tie it somehow to how gender impacts conflict. This is something that we probably see in pop culture a lot more, in a comedic sense, because, and I will show you the example. And yes, it's from New Girl. Don't come at me. It's just New Girl is so good at making these things funny. Okay, so because they exaggerate the way that we're expected to be as traditional gender roles. And so oftentimes women are and girls are encouraged by socialization to play nice and to avoid conflict, which, I mean, also leads to passive aggressive and more petty mental issues, like mental conflict. I find within anyone who's told to play nice as a kid. But then also on the flip side, men and boys are encouraged to engage in conflict directly, nip it at the bud, using aggressive or competitive behaviors. But those aggressive and competitive behaviors should not hurt women. And sometimes passive aggressive and demand withdrawal patterns frequently characterize conflict between men and women. So going back to that passive aggressive behaviors that women may use with men and vice versa. So I have used two examples and they're YouTube shorts, so they're short. And they're both from New Girl. It's from the same scene, but I had to bring it out. I couldn't find it all at once, so it's if you start with men fight and then it'll go to girl fight, it's fine. Or if you start with girl fight and then you go to men fight and then you realize that it continues on, you can stop it. Anyways, point is, in this episode, you see that two of the main characters, Schmidt and Coach, begin this conflict over what is recorded on the TV. And they start to get into a disagreement, but instead they stop. One of them hits the other one in the groin, and they shake it out. Good fight, we're done. And then they let it blow over. And then another main character, Jess, comes in and says, "This is crazy that you guys fight like this. Like, that's not healthy." But then immediately goes into a very unhealthy pattern behavior about how her and Cece have passive aggressive fights, specifically over a yellow purse. So take a watch to that video, and it is quite funny to show the reality of how gender impacts conflict. And of course, culture can also impact conflict. When we talk about, and again, this comes up because we talk about it at the beginning of the semester, it comes up so often. We talk about individualistic cultures and collectivistic cultures. So remember, in the United States, we're part of an individualistic culture. And a part of that, in this culture, we teach people to stand up for themselves in the face of conflict. Because remember, individualistic people, it's me, myself, and I first. I care about me, myself, and I. Whereas the collectivistic cares about more, not cares more, but focuses more so on the society as a whole, the community. So with collectivistic cultures, they encourage accommodation rather than conflict because they want to preserve that group harmony. And rather than bringing that conflict to the surface and causing a rift between that community, they'd rather just more so agree to disagree. And then language used within that conflict also can differ between low and high context cultures. So if you remember, the low and high context, again, going back to directly to the point, high context, or beating around the bush, low context. And so if you're getting directly to the point, while you are addressing the conflict straight on, it can create a bigger rift depending on what kind of context, culture the person you're in conflict comes from. So they may have grown up in a more low context where they prefer to beat around the bush. They prefer to accommodate. But you would come off more aggressive, even though that's just the way you grew up because of a high context. And then, of course, this kind of goes into what I just said. Cross culture conflict is so common because of how we differ with our traditions and expectations and how we were raised. Again, were you raised low or high context? Were you raised individual or collective? So it's always really important that you keep these things in mind where maybe somebody's coming off pretty hot and you're thinking, well, is that just the way they were raised to handle conflict? And sometimes it benefits, again, communicating. It benefits to say, hey, just so you know, like this is the way I was raised, so I'm a little thrown off about what is happening. And then we can also add another layer to this, and that being online. Online culture, again, its own little co-culture, creates this environment in which people can say what they want, this disinhibition effect, and it encourages you to say or do things that you wouldn't in person. We call those oftentimes, especially when it's negative, we call them keyboard warriors. They're so willing to say anything they want behind a keyboard, but it wouldn't be something that they would do in person because of societal norms. And this can encourage new conflicts or inflame existing ones, whether they started online or face to face. And so I want you guys to do the additional reading, and this is disinhibition and online gaming connection to cyberbullying. We see this a lot, and I think it's just really important to take a look at how maybe we didn't realize it happened or how seamlessly we became as a society so accepting of keyboard warriors, and how what's the real repercussion of that? Is there any? Especially as it leads something how it starts so innocently or may feel innocent and then turns into cyberbullying so quickly. So take a read of that. And then also, we have several communication strategies that help people avoid or manage conflict in online settings. And we've talked about this. Online creates, we would call it the, oh gosh, I'm forgetting the words now. It's Saturday, guys. It creates, it has the least amount of substance. So it's the highest chance of you misinterpreting what is said. So if you want to avoid and manage online conflict, don't respond right away. Think about it. Let it sit for a minute and then think to yourself, maybe I should clarify. Maybe I misunderstood something. What's the context in which this is being said? Maybe I should put myself in their shoes and see maybe if they meant it like that or if they meant it somebody else. And then if all that comes and you still feel like you should respond, maybe use a richer channel. Lean, that's the word I was looking for earlier, guys. Lean channels. So online communication is often lean in the sense that it doesn't have a lot of ways for you to create cues, or not create cues, but create them and adhere to them. And so when you want to avoid that conflict and you don't respond right away, you think you need to clarify, you put yourself in their shoes, using a richer channel to respond, like face to face, a phone call or video chat. Because now, again, then you bring in all of those nonverbal cues, right? You bring in their facial expressions, you bring in their tone, you bring in so many things that can help you decipher if that simple message was intended to create conflict or not. Continuing to talk about things that impact conflict, let's take a look at power and conflict. So, power, first of all, let's define that, is the ability to influence or to control other people or events. And so, power is context specific. So, we have to remember that. So, when I say context specific, I mean your boss has power of you over you while you're at work, but they shouldn't when you're at home. Um, and so that power conflict can only happen in a work setting. But power is always present. There is always some sort of power in every interpersonal interaction that you have. Now, they look a little bit different depending on the interaction. And so we look at a couple different ways. We look at symmetrical relationships of power, which is roughly equal power within that relationship. So you and your friends have the same power, or you and your partners. And then you have complementary, which is one person has more power over the other. So a teacher student. And it's important that one person in that scenario have more power because there has to be a leader in that situation. And for me, I'm teaching you guys and I'm bringing you content. And content and education and knowledge. I have more power in that situation. And then the way that people act or interact with each other is dependent on that relationship. So you wouldn't talk to me the same way that you chit chat with your bestie. You might try, but that would be seen as inappropriate. And so power influences communication in that way. And communication scholar Philip Erickson broke this down into three types of verbal messages. You have the one up message, the one down message, and then you also have the one across message. So one up messages express dominance. And it's a command like do the dishes or stop making so much noise. So you are asserting dominance over somebody by commanding them to do something. However, if you choose not to do a more dominant approach, you could have a one down message. And that's more submissive. And it's accepting others' opinions or it's asking for others' opinions as well. So you might ask your partner or a friend, where would you like to go for dinner? Or if somebody asked you that, you might respond with, whatever you think, whatever you want. That's fine. So you're accepting and asking for opinions. It's more of a reciprocal relationship rather than a power struggle. And then you also have the one across messages, which they're not dom nor sub. Like they don't have any sort of power within the message. It's very neutral. You're rather just stating a fact. So you might be talking to your sibling and say, Dad needs a new pair of shoes. You're not you're not telling them to get dad new shoes. You're not asking them where you should get the shoes from. You're simply stating a fact that dad needs a new pair of shoes. And you could respond in the same manner saying, well, there's so many to choose from. Symmetrical relationships utilize all three of these messages interchangeably because, again, there's no real power struggle or power conflict. But in complementary relationships, one person might use one type more than the other. So as a teacher, I might use one up messages more politely to you guys saying, you need to do this assignment. And you might use one down messages more often. How would you like that submitted? And so complementary relationships don't necessarily use all three of these types of messages, but symmetrical relationships do. And power can be positive and negative. It doesn't have to, and I know we think of power and we often think, I mean, my brain immediately goes to villains misusing power in superhero movies, but how conflict with power is handled is based on the agreement of power. So if a your kids become a teenager and now they want to defy power, right? That could create negative conflict, or that can create like a negative use of power um, and create conflict. So it can also create negative conflict if the person in power utilizes their power unethically. Abusing their power can create resentment within a relationship. But power and conflict can influence each other positively too. So when that child turns a year older, they may create conflict and defy your parental power to ask for a later curfew. That leads to an open discussion, and now that debate led to that teenager getting an extra hour of their curfew. So this conflict influenced power. Okay, so now we want to talk about, because we're still in power, we're talking about five forms of power from our communication scholars, French and Raven. They talk about reward power, coercive power, referent power, legitimate power, and expert power. So, reward power comes from the ability to reward somebody. So, you may think about a judge on a competition show like Dancing with the Stars that we're all really into right now. Um, you can talk about coercive power, which is the power which is the ability to punish. So, judges, parents, employers, cops. They all have some sort of coercive power over you because your parents can ground you, a judge can sentence you, a cop can give you a ticket, employers can fire you. You have referent power, which is power from attraction. People tend to listen to others that they're attracted to, and you'll see this utilized a lot in marketing. PETA used Pamela Anderson, which I mean at the time Pamela was the sex icon, the woman that everyone was attracted to, and so they utilized her beauty to exert some sort of power about their message, which was ethical treatment of animals. And you have legitimate power, which is actual power based on status and positions. So your doctor again has power in the doctor's office, but of course wouldn't have power in your mechanic's body shop. Flight attendants and pilots, they have the most power in an airplane. But again, the flight attendant probably doesn't have a lot of power at your doctor's office. So legitimate power, it's also relies on context. And then you have expert power, which is someone's expertise in the field giving them legitimate power. So listening to your professor teaching you a specific subject, or a mechanic with your car, because you don't know that information, they are the expert to give it to you, giving them legitimate power. And then, of course, we talk about gender again. Gender influences power. Um, and oftentimes we think about the patriarchy, which is a social system that men exercise majority of the power. Um, if anyone's a Taylor Swift fan, I did this slide and I thought about All Too Well the entire time I wrote it. So we talk about patriarchy, and when we have a patriarchal system, this leads men to exercise power, whether it be political, religious, economic, all those types of power over women. And historically, women, um, this patriarchal system has historically led to women having limited access to education, lower quality of healthcare, fewer economic opportunities, and limited political involvement. That doesn't, however, mean that there has been none. There are some very powerful women now, especially in our political system, but also in other countries leading their countries, prime ministers and presidents, depending on what country we're talking about. So it's not a doom and gloom. Patriarchy is the worst. It's just it made it harder for women to have the same level of power. And then, of course, as always, conflict is also impacted, or power and conflict is also impacted by culture. And so, culture in a high power distance culture, they accept those differences as normal and even desirable. So you might have like a monarchy, and you see that as like, oh, this is exactly how we have to handle it. That's just the way things go. But in a more low power distance cultures, again, that's what the United States is. We often question power differences, and I mean, we do so with elections, obviously. We don't like something, and they don't give us the answer we need. We can change that. We have some power. And remember, low power distance just means smaller distance, shorter distance between the people and the power. And so now we're wrapping up. We want to talk about managing interpersonal conflict. I've told you all these things and what conflict is and how you can identify it so you can eventually see it and address it. And so John Gottman's Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse takes a look at criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling as four of the key factors to determine if someone will break up. So he argued that rather than how much people argue, a better determinant is how they argue if a couple will break up. So if they're criticizing, complaining about the other person, you never listen type things, and they're doing it consistently. Contempt, it's the expression of insults and attacks on another person. So if you're calling your partner stupid or telling them what they did is dumb or putting them down. Defensiveness. This is a tactic that casts yourself as the victim and denies any responsibility. So it's not my fault, or you started it, or I only did this because of you. And then stonewalling, withdrawing from the conversation altogether. These are four things that Gottman said if the more that he saw this in relationships, the more likely that couple was to break up. It didn't necessarily mean that it had to happen again often, but every time it got brought up, it was one more check mark of how likely they were to break up. But now managing it in a healthy way, some of these may sound unhealthy, but I promise utilized properly can be healthy as well. So we have competing, avoiding, accommodating, compromising, and collaborating. So competing is a strategy for managing conflict where the one person's goal is to win and the other's is to lose. So your goal is to win, meaning the other party has to lose. So when it's agreed upon that this will be the outcome, it can be healthy. It gets unhealthy when you use toxic behaviors to win, like tearing the other person down. But if you know that, if I go all the way back to that example of buying a TV or saving for vacation, if you know that the strat or that somebody has to lose in that debate, you bring the facts of, well, here's what a vacation can bring us. Memories, joy, time away, things like that. And then someone else who's like, well, the TV can bring us, well, ours is broken, or ours um, is outdated. You can watch the football game better, things like that. If you bring proper evidence to the conflict, competing is a healthy strategy. And then there's avoiding, which is ignoring or failing to deal. It's not stonewalling, like I mentioned in Gottman's example, because stonewalling means you're in the conflict and now you've just shut yourself down and left. But avoiding ignores the conflict from the jump. You don't see it as conflict. Utilized negatively, obviously, this can be a toxic trait, but properly, it can help benefit the relationship. And then you have accommodating and compromising, which I think kind of, actually, no, accommodating, compromising, and collaborating kind of all go together. Accommodating is giving the other person what they want and not your own. Compromising is finding the middle ground. And collaborating is working towards a solution that meets both needs. So these all kind of help you guys work together of what can we do? I'll give it to you this time. Maybe we'll do it next time my way. And these are all important ways to decide how to manage conflict. And so when we utilize these, it can help prevent Gottman's Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, determine how you'll break up. So that is it. That's all for this chapter. I will post this and then I will work on the last chapter, which is talking about deceptive behaviors as well.